Hello, everyone, and welcome to the National Environmental Science Program Climate Systems Hub's Using Drought Projections in Wildlife Conservation webinar. For those of you I haven't met, my name is Helen Blaustein, and I'm the Climate Systems Hub Knowledge Broker for Victoria, working from the Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action. I work alongside other knowledge brokers in the Hub, collaborating on the science with the researchers and colleagues across governments and other organisations. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more on today's topic, which is about a case study the Climate Systems Hub did alongside the Australian Wildlife Conservancy. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional custodians of the lands where I am joining you from today. We pay respects to their elders past and present and would like to extend respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders joining us today. The Climate Systems Hub recognises the really important role traditional knowledge plays in understanding Australia's climate. Now, I'd like to set the scene and provide some background about the Climate Systems Hub webinars. If this is your first one, welcome. The webinars are designed to provide an opportunity for sharing and learning. We've had a fabulous range of presentations to date, and you can find all the recordings on our website, as well as fact sheets and case studies explaining the work. So please take a look. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. So the webinar is being recorded and the link will be available from the NESP Climate Systems Hub website after the webinar. We really encourage you to ask questions, and this can be done at any time by typing them into the chat function. We'll address as many of them as possible later in the session, and I encourage you to get in early as we don't always have time to get to all of them, but we'll do our best. For today's webinar, we're thrilled to have Hub researcher Vanessa around explain how the Hub's research is improving our ability to understand drought, and also a very, very special guest from the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, Dr. Jennifer Pierson, who will explain how this really important research is being used for decision making. So without any further delay, I'd like to warmly welcome our first speaker, Vanessa Round. Vanessa is a climate scientist at CSIRO. She studies drought, aiming to better understand how they've changed over the recent past and what's likely in the future. Her work centres on understanding how the climate may evolve, drawing on climate modelling and other lines of evidence. Vanessa's focus is on connecting decision makers with climate projection information, and she works really closely with others to understand climate change impacts and vulnerability in different systems. As part of this bigger NESP research on extreme climate, which tackled droughts, extreme wet periods, and hot and dry events, Vanessa's focus has been drought impacts and projected future changes in drought. Welcome, Vanessa, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Helen, and thanks everybody for joining. I really hope you get something out of today's presentation. I just want to start by acknowledging the Kaurna people, who are the traditional custodians of Kaurna Yurta, Kaurna country, where I'm joining from in Southern Australia. So in today's webinar, I'm going to start with just a bit of a description of the drought information that's been developed as part of the NESP Hub, and then present a case study we did with AWC, that's the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, about drought impacts and how the drought information we've produced can be used. And then Jenny will present on how they're using climate info, including our drought projections in their adaptation planning. Sorry, just checking the click to the next slide. Yep. So drought's obviously a really natural and regular part of Australia's very variable climate. Depending where you are in Australia, you may or may not be thinking about drought or experiencing drought. But where I am in South Australia, we're currently going through a period of extreme drought. So working on this project while going through a drought has been really interesting. The picture on the right there is some of the vegetation dieback that we've experienced in my part of the Adelaide Hills. And the kind of questions that are coming up in my community are really exactly the kind of questions that we've been looking at through this project. So trying to understand, is this climate change? Are droughts like this going to become more intense or frequent in the future? If that is the case, what would that look like in terms of impacts, how our landscape might change, and what can we do to adapt or prepare if droughts like this do increase in the future? So the work I'm presenting draws on previous NESP Hub work, which developed future climate projections to answer that question of how the nature and occurrence of droughts might change in the future. But this more recent work we've done has really focused on facilitating the uptake of drought projections through working directly with stakeholders, including through case studies like this one with AWC. And we're also really interested in trying to understand what the implications are of future changes in drought. So understanding what the impacts are in the past and how that might evolve if droughts were to change in the future. And then progressing this through to actually using this information in making management decisions and adaptation planning, which is what Jenny will go into a little bit more. So just to start with, obviously, there are lots of different ways of defining and quantifying drought for different purposes and different sources. So I just want to introduce the drought index that we're using. It's the Standardized Precipitation Index, SPI, and it's based on rainfall. So it's meteorological drought, just based on rainfall deficiency. And what it does is it looks at rainfall over the last 12 months and determines how far away that is from the average long-term rainfall. So the figure there on the right shows a time series of this SPI index from 1970 for a region in South Australia. And the vertical axis is showing the SPI index. So positive values indicate above average and negative values indicate below average. And we can look at this index and determine periods of drought. And we determine them when the SPI value goes below -1 for at least 3 months. We then also categorize the droughts as to how severe they are, depending on how bad that driest period within that drought is. So on the figure here, you can see yellow periods of moderate drought, pink periods with severe drought, and then a couple of really dark red periods, which are extreme drought, where the driest point in that drought went below -2. So that's just to introduce the concept of droughts in different categories. And we also talk about just drought as a whole, combining all of those 3 categories. Yep. So as I mentioned before, we're drawing on projections that were created during NESP Stage 1, and these are published in a paper that was led by Dewi Korono, which really outlines all the detail about how we can look at drought in the future. So the projections are based on more than 30 climate models, which are used to compare, modelled historical to future drought indices and see what the models say about how droughts might evolve. And we look at different metrics of drought. So once we've figured out this sort of sequence of droughts, we can look at how much time have we spent in a particular category of drought, how long are the droughts on average, how often they occur, and how intense they are. So we've got 4 different metrics. We've got those different categories of drought I mentioned, and we've done this for rainfall drought, but also for soil moisture drought, which is a way of also accounting for the extra effects of heating and evapotranspiration. So what this can look like then in projections is shown on the figure on the right, which is showing the average projected change in drought from all of these climate models for the percent time, the duration, and the frequency. The brown coloured areas are showing an increase in drought, and the green are showing a decrease. So you can see some areas, especially southern Australia and sort of the northeast coast, where droughts are projected to become a sort of more time spent in droughts and longer. But if you look at the frequency, it's sort of showing actually a decrease, which might be a bit counterintuitive or confusing. But when we delve a bit deeper into this and look at specific drought metrics, in particular extreme drought, which are these most, the driest of the droughts, we see a similar picture, but for frequency, we see increases in many places. And this was something we found, that droughts are actually, in many places, projected to more often fall into that extreme category. So this more recent work, we've worked to make this information more accessible by summarising this for subregions in Australia. So I've shown here on the map 16 sub-clusters of NRM regions over Australia for which we have the data available, and we've also done this for custom regions for stakeholders like AWC. So what I've shown so far was the average projections from all of those climate models, but it's really important to keep in mind that there can be a really big range. So this figure here is showing the range of projected change from all of those models across those 16 regions. And you can see the bars are showing the percent of change in the amount of time spent in extreme drought conditions. So the bottom end of those bars sometimes shows a slight decrease and the top can show a really large increase. Another way we look at sort of understanding the projections is to look at how much the models agree with each other. So we've coloured the regions where more than 80% of models agree that this drought metric will increase in dark brown, and this allows us to identify regions where the projections are showing a stronger signal towards increasing drought. So in my case in South Australia, I can say, you know, this extreme drought we're experiencing, it's a normal part of the environment, but climate models, more than 80% agree for this region that these will become more frequent and more time spent in this kind of drought in the future. So yeah, as I mentioned, this data is available for these regions, also custom regions, and also gridded data sets for those more technical users. In terms of the AWC case study, so AWC came to us looking for help sort of selecting climate information, and we're really interested in drought in particular, having experienced impacts from droughts on their properties, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail. But this case study really allowed us to explore those questions I identified in the beginning about what the implications are of changing drought and how that information can actually be used in decision making. So the main questions which we had from AWC were interpreting all this projections data we have available, which metrics should they be looking at, which severity of drought is most useful for them, how can they sort of simplify this, and the ways we did this was to look at the past impact that they observed and how they connect to the drought metrics that I described, and then use the projections to highlight risks related to those impactful drought factors. So AWC are one of the largest conservation organisations in Australia, and they have over 30 properties spread all over the country. And so one part of this sort of data work that we did with AWC was to extract a historical time series of drought for each of those properties so that they could look at that and understand what they'd experienced in terms of this drought index, which was used for the projections. So the map is showing the locations of those properties overlaid over that projected change in drought that I showed you before. Those brown regions really highlighting areas which are expected to see more extreme drought in the future. But this first example, so this time series from 1970, like the one I showed before, is for a property in northwestern WA, where they actually haven't really experienced much drought in the last few decades. They've seen a real increase in extreme wet conditions. This wasn't the focus of our case study, but this kind of information can be used to see, well, were those little moderate droughts that occurred actually impactful, or what happened during that really extreme drought that's shown sort of in the 1990s? And if we look to one of their other properties, which is on the sort of southwest coast near Shark Bay, you can see quite a different picture where they've experienced periods of extreme drought in the past, and the most recent of this was also associated with big declines in some of their mammal populations. Moving to the focus of the case study, we looked at two properties, Scotia and Yucumurra, which are in southern Australia in the Murray Basin in the sort of arid lands. And here they had experienced really significant declines in some of their mammal populations during this period of drought in sort of 2019, 2020. So those two time series there, you can see, you know, there have been extreme droughts over the past few decades, and this last one was particularly severe, so that dark red period that's highlighted there. So the really great thing about working on this case study was that AWC actually have quite good population estimates twice a year over the last sort of 15 years or so from 2009. Because working with climate information, we're used to having, you know, continuous records from satellite observations or monitoring stations, but we very rarely have actual information on impacts over time, not just single impacts, but sort of a time spanning sequence of whatever we're trying to look at. So the graph on the right here is showing from 2008 to 2023 population estimates for a whole number of their very beautiful furry creatures. They're located in Scotia Sanctuary, which has 2 fenced off areas free from feral predators. So they've got bettong, numbats, woylies, bandicoots, and bilbies. And each of those lines is showing the estimates in the population that have been done sort of twice yearly. Overlaid on that, we have the 12-month aggregated rainfall as the dashed line at the top, and then highlighted with colour are periods of drought or wet that we've identified using the SPI metric. So one of the first things here just that we noticed was this mid-brown period there was identified as a severe drought, but we didn't actually seem to see any impact on the population there. When we move forward to this dark brown period, which was identified as an extreme drought, there was a really severe decline in most of those, or all of those populations, real, 90% reduction in some cases. So this is an indication that the extreme drought was really impactful, but at the same time, we also had an extreme heat event. We don't have the sort of temporal resolution to see exactly did the decline already begin before the heat event, was the heat, how important was this heat event? But that combination of extreme drought and heat was really impactful on the species here. Something else we noticed also was that the length of the drought didn't seem to be crucial, because this decline actually happened within the first half of the drought. It didn't sort of have to be a really long drought for this to happen. And another observation that was important was that during the sort of coming out of this extreme drought, we had a period that was identified as a moderate drought, which you might think, not great, but populations actually started to increase even during that, what would be called a moderate drought. So this is sort of pointing to the resilience of those and what's required for them to recover after one of these really impactful declines. So yeah, the summary of this was to simplify all of this drought information into focusing on extreme droughts in the future projections. So we did this for all of their properties over Australia, creating those summaries of future projected change in drought, which I showed for those other regions before, but for these specific properties. So you see those large ranges, and again, we've got the indication of how much model agreement there is between the models on a projected increase in future extreme drought. So this was really useful for AWC to be able to identify locations which where we're most certain that extreme droughts will continue or increase in the future, and also to quantify what that might actually look like how many months of drought on average would that be in those extreme conditions. So in sort of summary from that case study with AWC, it was really about co-designing the project for me to understand what their data needs were, and at first glance that might be simple, but when you dive into it, we could really tailor the data to be specifically relevant to their case. And that was specifically really understanding the impacts and how that interacts with the kind of climate data that we have. They weren't just interested in climate data though. There were a lot of other analysis, which Jenny's going to talk about soon, which required really detailed spatial data, which can't be done for every one of those 30 models. So we supported AWC in their selection of a simplified set of future scenarios from different models to make sure that in their analysis they weren't going to miss any really important potential changes by just picking, for example, one model which sounds nice or sits somewhere in the middle or someone else has used. So Jenny's going to talk through that and how they use that in vulnerability assessments for specific species spread over Australia, and also for their individual properties, which I've showed. So I think now I can pass the control over to you, Jenny. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Vanessa, for those excellent insights and the really clear explanation of drought and how all the different components fit together. There are already some questions coming in, so please keep them coming. We've got a dedicated Q&A session at the end, so just put your questions in the chat and we'll get to them later on. I'd like to now welcome our special guest from AWC, Dr. Jennifer Pierson. Jenny is a senior ecologist on Australian Wildlife Conservancy's National Science Team. Dr. Pierson leads the development and implementation of AWC's climate change adaptation strategy, as well as their conservation genetics program. She has a strong interest in the challenges faced by small populations with a background in conservation genetics and population ecology. Jenny's goal is to bridge the gap between research and management through applying scientific principles to the conservation and management of threatened species. Vanessa has already touched on what's behind the collaboration with AWC, and Jenny will tell us more. Welcome, Jenny, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Helen. I really appreciate the invitation to present today and the talk that Vanessa gave laying the groundwork for this. There we go. All right. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, we're a global conservation leader that's focused on restoring landscapes and securing the future of threatened wildlife. Our mission is the effective conservation of Australian wildlife and its habitats, and we do this through science-led management, innovation, and partnerships. And one of our real strengths is our reintroduction program, where we manage more safe havens than anyone else in Australia. And we currently manage 50 reintroduced populations of 20 different species. And you can see the map here again of the property and partnerships that we have across Australia currently. So one of the challenges in developing our climate change adaptation strategy was how to develop a strategic framework, given we had a suite of challenges. The first being we wanted something that would work at the national scale, but we know that climate change really is a local issue. And that is, climate impacts different areas differently, and the response to those impacts is also going to vary spatially. We had a variety of different programs that had different objectives that may interact differently in terms of climate change. And that being said, we know that climate change is going to impact absolutely everything that we did, all the management. And finally, and probably the most important thing, is we wanted any strategic plan that we developed to integrate directly into our operational planning. So from AWC's perspective, it was really important that this would really influence actions on the ground. So we decided to take a tiered approach to this, where we had a national level strategy that developed consistent principles for systematic assessment and planning, and we could apply these same principles to our different programs. And we started with 3 different programs that we knew would be impacted in terms of decision making and climate change most immediately, essentially. So we've got our reintroduction program, and that really is going to target individual species, potentially across multiple properties. We have our acquisition program, where we might be looking at new partnerships or new properties. And so we want to assess how climate change might impact the priority species and biodiversity overall at that site. And finally, we wanted to look at property level assessments to see how climate change might influence the conservation land management activities that we're doing at those sites and how we might implement adaptation planning to assist with that. And so for anybody who works in the climate change space, you're probably really familiar with this type of schematic for vulnerability assessment. So these 3 aspects of vulnerability assessment were proposed, way back in 2001 by IPCC and have been adapted many times since then. And so essentially you look at, 3 different things: exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, in a way to evaluate those to get a vulnerability score for a site or for a species. And first, thinking about exposure, that really describes the nature, magnitude, and rate of climate change. So how is the climate actually changing at the site? Sensitivity is going to be how a system or a species might be impacted by that change. And then the adaptive capacity is essentially, the system or the species' ability to respond to that change. So kind of inbuilt resilience, if you will. And next, again, it was really important to us that the vulnerability assessment wasn't where we stopped. We wanted to have the adaptation planning aspect of this be the identification of specific management actions. So we could really switch from a reactive approach to climate change to a proactive approach to climate change. And we wanted to make sure that this really assisted us with robust decision making in the context of, the uncertain future that we're facing. And again, anybody who works in this climate change space may be familiar, again, with this RAD framework that you can use to do that, where you look at either actions that resist the climate change impacts, accept them, or direct to a new future. And so today what I wanted to focus on is how we were able to work with the Hub and CSRO and Vanessa and others to assess exposure in two of our programs. And that was, in our reintroduction program, really targeting species, and in our conservation and land management program, targeting properties. So first with species, I'll take you through each one of these steps more detail. But overall, in the translocation program, the first challenge that we faced was that for a lot of these species that require reintroduction across their former distribution, declined dramatically before we had a good sense of where they actually historically existed. And we needed to understand their historic distribution to be able to estimate the historic climate envelope, or essentially evaluate the historic range of climate conditions the species may have experienced before their declines. Once we were able to get that information, we were able to then project this information forward to see where future conditions might match this climate envelope, and then overlay that with AWC properties to see how the areas that AWC manages might be exposed to these changing climate conditions. So first, with estimating the historic distribution, we took a very conservative approach to assessing these distributions. And we went through and identified, all of the historic records that we can identify for the species, and then briefly took what we consider, a bioregional approach. And so used, bioregion Australia to extrapolate to where they may have been. And then finally, once we compiled this, used an expert elicitation review process to finalize our estimated historic distributions. We were then able to, this is where we started working, very closely with Vanessa and others in the Hub to identify the metrics that she was talking about. So we were able to get the baseline layer for what we consider historic conditions, and then look at two different aspects of their climate envelope. So the first one was looking at their mean climate envelope. And within that, we selected 4 different variables to look at, and these really describe kind of those conditions that we would consider driving distribution. So, not only the actual species distribution that we're interested in, but the community and its habitat that's there. And so we looked at a range of things like max, mean, and min daily temperatures, and also annual precipitation. In combination with that, we're also really interested in starting to evaluate the impact of these extreme conditions that we're already experiencing now, and we know will increase. And so for species, we looked at, we started by looking at what were the extreme heat conditions that existed in the past and how those might change in the future. And so we worked with Vanessa to understand what the standard definitions for these were, and looked at, very hot days are generally considered over 40 degrees, and very hot nights are generally considered over 25 degrees. And again, this is where our work, the really meat of the work that we did with these guys was looking at, projecting these climate variables forward. And like Vanessa touched on, working on how could we get down from, the well over 30 climate models that exist to something that was very tractable for us to be able to do internally with the resources we had. So we didn't want to just look at one model. So what we were able to do is identify a bit of, a sandwich set of models that gave us the range of future conditions that Australia might experience. So we looked at, what might be considered a very hot and dry future model, what might be considered a very cool and wet future model, and what might be considered a mid-range model. And with that, we also wanted to look at 2 different emission scenarios. So not just the worst case scenario, but also take into account a mid-range emission scenario. And that gave us 6 different scenarios that we were projecting forward. And then we also wanted to consider 2 different time frames. So the first one was 2050, which in the scheme of things is getting pretty near term. It's only 25 years away. So that's kind of our, direct now management actions. And then those future conditions that might exist all the way up to 2070. And so what we did is we projected all of these 6 scenarios forward, and we can overlay them with that distribution to be able to really quickly see which parts of the distribution in this dark purple clearly stay within those historic conditions. And as you go up and go towards green and yellow, you see fewer and fewer of those scenarios that stay within the historic climate conditions that the species experienced. And areas that are yellow, all of those scenarios actually move outside of those historic conditions. And then finally, in the last step to assess exposure, we overlaid these with AWC properties that actually fall within that distribution. And that gives us a way to actually, in these vulnerability assessments, score something like exposure to be able to put it into a systematic framework of evaluation. And for this particular species, what we can see is on AWC properties, this exposure is quite low. Even when we look at, only one scenario moves outside, and that's only at 20% of the properties. So we feel really confident in this low assessment here. We also do consider the proportion of the distribution. And again, for this species, we see only in the most extreme scenarios do we even have much of a reduction at all of that distribution that's impacted. So overall, this is a very low exposure for this species. So next in our conservation and land management program, this one was a little bit different because we wanted to look at how climate change will impact not only the conservation value, so the biodiversity at the site, but also our operational assets. So things like infrastructure and operational capacity. And this is really important because we have to remember that, it's really people delivering these biodiversity and conservation programs. So we need to have people being able to access and work in the site, even if it's going to be, and understand the impacts of things like extreme heat and increases in humidity. And again, we're really interested in making sure that this framework led us to what management actions we could do proactively to help that situation. And when you look out in the literature and the gray literature as well, there's a ton of different property vulnerability assessments that exist, but the only really, general principle is the same framework from IPCC. And so looking at that, we decided again, to look at what was out there and identify which bits were really important to assess for AWC's purposes. And one of the things that's quite common in the property assessments is using what's, a really familiar risk assessment table. And that worked really well for us because, again, people working on the ground are really familiar with this type of approach of risk assessment. And so it wasn't something foreign to them to learn that was new. The other thing that was really useful for us is being able to adapt this framework to be able to apply it to both conservation and operational assets. So we could take a very holistic view to climate change exposure assessment for the whole program at one property. Within that, we're able to look at kind of a climate stressor by asset vulnerability rating that facilitated prioritization not only among our sites, but also within the properties. So we were able to score and say which climate stressor is causing the most risk for the asset and say what asset should we really be focusing on in terms of risk for that property. And that approach led us to being able to identify management actions that might ameliorate those impacts to that particular asset. So again, this is where we're working really closely with the hub to identify, the range of climate stressors and more importantly, the metrics that we're able to do for that. And then with those metrics, get appropriate, layers that we could use to evaluate those. So for the properties, we looked at a broader range of not just the mean climate variables, but also a lot of these extreme events that are impacting our properties now and will likely impact them more in the future. So we've got air temperature change and extreme heat again, but also this is where we want to look at the range of drought metrics and how they might apply, a range of precipitation metrics, things like storm intensity and frequency. Again, humidity change may be really important, particularly for people's ability to deliver the programs. And again, fire danger is something that's going to, potentially have a big impact in terms of how both biodiversity and our operational assets are impacted. So things like, the shifts in the number of days with the severe fire range or danger can help us see how we might shift our work programs. And again, working with Vanessa was really invaluable to know if we're interested in these climate stressors, what layers are available and what are the standard metrics that currently exist and which ones go together. How can we interpret, this layer compared to that layer in terms of the data that's behind them, what was appropriate and what was inappropriate in terms of our interpretation of all of this data. And so again, we use the same 6 scenarios to project forward. And so for this particular property, what you can see is that we have different climate stressors with different, trends and confidence in terms of what's happening there. So for example, in terms of extreme heat at this property, we can be really confident that there's going to be an increase there. So you can look at the baseline on the left compared to what we see in terms of, the median and that variation in 2050 versus 2070. We're really confident it's going to get a lot hotter at this property. Whereas when we look at the mean annual precipitation at this site, what we see is that we're not quite sure what's going to happen. When you look at the baseline, it's kind of, smack in the middle of the variation of what might occur in the future. And so for this, our confidence is much lower in saying what might happen for rainfall. And And so you have to take a much more like hedge your bets type approach and be ready for anything when we're thinking about that type of metric. And again, this is, what Vanessa touched on before, not just within properties for those different metrics, but among properties for us, this is really invaluable. It really just jumps out at you to say, not just, the amount of change, but how confident we are that that change is going to happen allows us to prioritize very easily which sites we need to make sure to do these, prioritize the vulnerability assessments and identify the management actions that we may be able to do proactively for something like drought at these sites. So while a lot of this work is still currently underway, we've been able to uptake it into much of our planning already. So for example, for the species that we do reintroductions for, we spend a lot of time planning these processes through translocation proposals. And a standard part of our translocation proposal now is a full exposure assessment for that species across its historic distribution. Similarly, for any strategies or plans that we're writing at the property level now, or any acquisitions that we're looking at, we have included the property level exposure assessment for those strategies and plans. So as we, continue on these vulnerability assessments, this work is already informing all of the decision-making and planning processes that we're doing, and we'll continue to use it, in a very iterative way. So I just, again, really wanted to thank the Hub and Helen and Vanessa for inviting me here today and for all of their work with us over the last couple of years. It's really been an invaluable collaboration for AWC. And we're really looking forward to, continuing the work in the future, because I think this is the kind of thing where, we all need to tackle these things together to be able to understand how we might overcome some of these challenges with climate change. When you're first getting into looking at this stuff, it can be quite overwhelming in terms of where to begin and what to evaluate and how to do it. And so this has been, such a great partnership for us in terms of that. Also wanted to thank a lot of the folks at AWC who have helped with this work. So particularly Hannah Mullis has done the climate change projections that you've seen today, and Nick Gum, who's been collaborating with me on the conservation land management strategy. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Vanessa.
Thanks so much, Jenny. Just before Vanessa gets her go. Thank you so much for that excellent presentation. So Vanessa is going to touch briefly on lessons learned and where else the research is being used. Thank you, Vanessa.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Helen. I will keep it very brief because we've got plenty of questions and I think it's good to be able to have time to answer them. A real kind of key takeaway from this collaboration was, from my side, from the sort of climate projection side, that understanding the stakeholder needs is really important. And, you find out surprising things about what you assume people need, or ways in which the data can be presented in different ways. So that's been really useful for both parties, I think. And especially in these drought metrics, we sort of produce these drought metrics and really wanted to understand what they might mean. And through the case study, I think just realizing how complex it can be. Case by case, you're going to get very different impacts in different places, different sensitivities to different kinds of drought metrics. So at least from this very localized case study on these two properties, it just highlighted the importance of, really place-based approach if you're specifically thinking about the impacts and management for locations. I really enjoyed the aspect of looking at the historical impacts, like having that real world data out of the two properties we looked at in terms of the population, because we really want to understand the implications of future change, but it's really hard to understand the impacts if we don't have this kind of systematically collected data. So that was a really great opportunity to work with AWC. And in general, it's really inspiring to see the work AWC are doing in actually like powering ahead with making actual informed decisions using the best available science. So it's been a privilege for me to be part of that as well. We've used similar methods and data, so looking at this historical time series to understand impacts and how they're related to droughts, and then using that in our translation for future projections, also in assessments of climate vulnerability and adaptation planning in a number of Ramsar wetlands around Australia, and also crossover with other stakeholders and researchers, including from the NESP Resilient Landscapes Hub and some of their work. So I think without a further ado, we'll head to some questions.
Thanks, Vanessa. And just while we're gathering all the questions, please keep putting them in the chat. Just going through them at the moment. But yeah, before we do that, on the screen you can see the link and the nice front covers of the case study and also the explainer on this work. So please head to the website after the webinar, take a read and share with your colleagues. We'd be, yeah, really excited if you could do that. So on to the questions. Just bear with me for a second. Okay, so there's quite a few here, so we'll see how we go. The first one's for Vanessa. What was the time frame for the drought projections, and how does the increase in average temperatures influence the chances of drought? It's a two-pronged question.
Yeah, good question. I didn't cover that because I didn't want to go into every detail, but we have the projections looking at future 20-year periods based on change from a 1986 to 2005 baseline. But when we were looking at the extreme droughts, which were identified as really important, because they don't happen very often, it was quite like the data was very patchy. You might look at that 20-year baseline period and there are no extreme droughts. So it's really hard to determine what the change is. So to address that, and the projections I showed today were all based on a century versus century projected change. So how much these drought metrics are projected to change over the coming century on average over this sort of 100-year period compared to the previous 100 years that we've had. Yeah, so obviously that's, you know, looking over a very long time period, but because of the huge amount of variability naturally in rainfall and drought, that gives us a much more robust estimate than just looking at a shorter period for these really rare kind of extreme droughts. It's different if you're looking at drought in general. When you add in something like temperature, there's obviously a very scenario dependent change into the future with much higher warming at the end of the century to, you know, the next few decades. So that's something which has to be considered separately to that. We do have also the SPEI, also the soil moisture drought, which does factor in that, you know, increase in temperature and evapotranspiration indirectly as well. So yeah, hopefully that answers that. And also mention the projections are done under a high emission scenario, so the RCP 8.5, which gives us this sort of, it's a worst case emissions scenario, but gives us a picture of this kind of largest possible change in terms of the projections.
Fantastic, thank you so much. So the next couple of questions I'm actually going to ask to both you and Jenny, Vanessa, but might start with you. So and if it's not you, please, Jenny, answer it. So the question is, at Scotia, the severe drought also occurred on the back of a wet period, which could have fortified the mammal populations against the ensuing drought. So did you explore that, Vanessa, or conversely, Jenny, did that come up in any of the conversations as you were unpacking these numbers?
Yeah, I think it just highlights how complex it is. You know, you can't look at one single event on its own and sort of make your conclusions. So we looked at the time series we had, which was, you know, 15 years or so. And there was a period that I pointed out of severe drought where the populations didn't decrease. And that was off the back of a severe wet period. So there's a wet period and then a severe drought with not much impact. So we don't know if that drought had occurred on an already sort of stressed population, we might have seen more impacts during a severe drought. And then the extreme drought that we saw, the big decline during, that followed 4 years or so of quite average rainfall, where populations had, you know, fluctuated a bit, but been relatively steady for about 6 years. So I don't think the extreme drought was sort of the case of a big boom and bust, but the impacts could have been worse if it had been more stressed, or they maybe could have been better if it had been followed by a wet period. So I think it is not just a single event or a single drought, and it's not just drought, it's also what happens in between the droughts. For example, the Millennium Drought, and when we look at this drought metric, the Millennium Drought was hugely impactful, but it wasn't just one big severe drought. It was, dry periods, some more severe than others, but a real lack of any real wet periods in between. So it's sort of the absence of wet as well as the presence of drought. So yeah, Jenny would have a much better perspective on the actual understanding of the population dynamics.
Yeah, Jenny, did you want to have a go at that? And also there's a part B to that question as well, which I might put that to you at the same time. So, and it connects into the graph that you showed, Vanessa, aligning the rainfall and mammal populations. And yeah, someone's also noticed the importance of the period prior to the drought. So before that severe drought period, there was a period of the higher rainfall, which seemed to lead to a boom in some populations. So would that, do you think, influence resilience in the face of drought?
I think Vanessa did a really good job of answering, I guess, the complications of the patterns over time. And so I think, within that site, like Vanessa said, we didn't necessarily see a huge boom outside of those normal fluctuations of that site in terms of the population patterns there. And I think with the amount of decline, whether or not, that wet would have been able to provide that buffer, it's really hard to say. I think it's really, what was really interesting to us, I think the two aspects were that it was the extreme drought and the ability to recover it in that moderate drought, but also that time period, how long it stays in drought, because that was probably one of the really unknown things for us. Is it something that's kind of, slowly happening, and the longer the drought goes on versus, what we saw with that and the outcome is that really wasn't the duration of the drought there. It was that extreme drought in a pretty short period of time that happened. So whether or not, if you had more or less before that, you'd have any impact in terms of that proportional change, it's really actually very hard to say because that impact was there. And I guess the other thing touching on with that too is that combination of cumulative impacts. And so Vanessa noted as well the extreme heat that happened at that point, and what we've seen in terms of that combination when you get extreme heat and drought, which is likely to, I think, happen more as well, and that impact that we saw. And we're very interested in how those type of things interact.
Thanks, Jenny. Another question for you, Jenny. What species or ecosystems within AWC properties were identified as most vulnerable to drought?
So when we look at that, it's pretty clear that the Southwest properties, again, no surprise looking at those maps, are going to be the ones that are, jumping out as looking at having the biggest increase in the percent time with that high confidence. And so we have a suite of properties in Southwest WA. And, I think the most surprising one for us is the one on Kangaroo Island did come up as having a potential increase in that as well. But other than that, nothing surprising in terms of the sites. The other side of that was, places like Scotia and Yucca-Murray, where we have experienced the drought, didn't come out as having a huge increase. And so that was nice in terms of, the conditions that we're used to experiencing there and managing may stay relatively within what we're used to experiencing and managing.
Thank you. And did you have any insight into any of the species in particular that might have been more vulnerable through this work?
Yeah, I mean, through this work, we haven't gotten probably to that stage of it. And so we're really focusing on the properties for the drought assessment right now, because there's a real interaction in terms of the resources that are available at the site and how those resources are impacted that lead on to the species. And so, with individual species, there's a lot of mechanistic responses they may have in association with, direct impacts from things like extreme heat. But when we're looking at drought, a lot of it is going to be an indirect impact in terms of the resources that are available at the site and how that gets impacted. So we're really taking a property by species based approach for that.
Excellent, thank you. I might throw one back to Vanessa, and then I've got another one in the queue for you after that, Jenny. But Vanessa first, have you thought about how you might incorporate the compounding or cascading impacts of extreme events into any of this work that you've done?
Not specifically or quantitatively, but I think it is front of mind, even looking at the case study in particular, not looking just at drought in isolation, but how that coincided with really extreme heat. I think it would be interesting to look at sort of future projections of extreme heat coinciding with extreme drought as well, so that those sort of overlapping hazards compound each other. I think that's something that's really important to have in mind and would be good to have a better understanding of, because that's when you really get the impact. And there are also, feedbacks as well with land atmosphere, extreme heat, and also drought conditions and, rapid drying, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. The next one for Jenny is, how can these long-term drought forecasts be integrated into habitat management and wildlife corridor planning?
I'll do the habitat management first, I guess. And so for us, what we're trying to do is assess, for each ecosystem, because different ecosystems may have different responses in terms of that drought risk as well. And so when we look at that risk for the ecosystems, what we can do is come up with those different management actions around, if we want to maintain the ecosystem as it is, if we want to resist, if you will, are there some sort of approaches that we might take to be able to look at things like how do we, increase the ability to retain soil moisture? So that's a really, important bottom-up aspect of this. And so that's research that we're really interested in, collaborating with people on right now, is what type of techniques can you use for that? In other cases, it may be kind of that accept and direct. And so if we know that there may be some of these transitions, do we monitor along the way and see what's going to happen? Or in some cases, do we try to proactively, do things like, you can, plant seeds that are more adapted to those type of things, or maybe have projections around what type of community it may shift into. So the habitat planning allows us to have this range of options of what we might do. In terms of wildlife corridors, a lot of our properties, we're dealing with properties, at very large scale, so hundreds of thousands to millions of hectares. And so we are looking at priority areas and then how we might connect those areas with our threat management. So this is, that would be how we would overlay it with that, is really focus on how things like fire management, weed management, and feral management might be prioritized in the context of wildlife corridors.
Excellent, thank you. And the next one is potentially for both of you, but maybe Jenny first. So were there any unexpected findings about how drought affects wildlife movement, behaviour, or breeding?
I think one of the most encouraging things was looking at the recovery during moderate drought. I mean, I think the common conception is that you really need this wet period following that to get that recovery. And in some of these arid landscapes, you don't often get, that period for boom. And so once the extreme drought was over and we still had a bit of a moderate drought, we saw, really good trend of population recovery during that time. So that was a very encouraging signal for us.
Thanks, Jenny. And Vanessa, was there anything unexpected or, anything, I guess, that surprised you through doing this work?
Yeah, I guess I haven't worked with sort of this kind of species data before. I was amazed how huge the reduction in population could be, from thousands of animals down to less than 100 over the course of 6 months or so. So that was kind of surprising. From the drought side, I mean, it was more reinforcing what I expected. And going back to the previous question as well, really the importance of these compound sort of drought and dry, like we know, there's a lot of uncertainty in the drought projections, but we know extreme heat is going to increase in the future. So understanding that and then compounding that with the possibility of increased drought as well is something that's just very clear to me now.
Excellent, thank you. I might just squeeze one more question in for Jenny, actually. So, it's another two-parter. Is the AWC adaptation strategy publicly available?
Currently, it's not. So a lot of this work is still in progress. So our national kind of level strategy has been lined out, and then we're finalizing. So we do plan on, eventually trying to publish, some of this work. And then at some stage, we may put some things on the website as well, but it's a bit in progress still in terms of being publicly available.
sorry, and the next one's another looking ahead. So is AWC planning to, I don't know, even if this is possible, planning to increase the resilience of the ecosystems and the species themselves so they can cope with increasing extremes?
Definitely. I mean, adaptive capacity, I think, is one of the places that we're targeting in terms of management actions most directly. So, with these vulnerability assessments, our two options are to reduce sensitivity and increase adaptive capacity. So with species, in some ways, that's a little bit more straightforward because one of the main ways we can increase adaptive capacity is by managing that genetic diversity. So species can, if we want them to be able to behaviorally or physiologically adapt to places, we want to be able to, increase that genetic diversity through things like, genetic mixing when we're founding reintroduced populations, and also making sure that we're having populations across the range of their historic conditions so they're exposed to those selective factors. So we're already very actively managing that. With properties, the adaptive capacity is really around, we know that biodiversity creates more resilience. And so through our threat management, already we're increasing the resilience and adaptive capacity of these sites. And we'll continue to do that and look for more innovative ways to reduce that sensitivity of these sites.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We're pretty much out of time for questions, so we might move on just to the final slide, please. Just wanted to thank our presenters so much for such an informative and insightful session, and to all of you for your active participation and engagement. Those questions were fantastic. Also wanted to thank everyone for supporting the Climate Systems Hub, and we really hope that you've taken something from today. On the screen, you can see the contact details for Vanessa and Jenny, and also information, the Hub's website and URLs, also for AWC, the website, and email details. We've got some great webinars lined up for the rest of the year, so please subscribe to our newsletter and keep an eye on your inbox for more information about what's coming up. And also please spread the word to anyone else you think may be interested. And in addition, if you have suggestions for future webinar topics, please email info@nesp2climate.com.au, and that email address is on the screen at the moment. You can scroll through the website for regular news and science updates, and the address for that should be in the chat for you to access. And before we finish, we really, really value your feedback. So there should be a link to a brief survey in the chat, and we'll also include the link when we share the recording with you all in the coming days. Actually, that might be after Easter, just as a flag. And yeah, I think that is it. So thanks again to our presenters, and there have been many others behind the scenes really actively helping make today happen. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you all next time. Thank you.